the great story is of our country is the deep time connection that we all share to this land, and that flows through First Nations people and can be shared with broader Australians.
Welcome to The Greener Way. I'm Rosemary Petrass, Senior Journalist at FS Sustainability. We are recording on Gadigal land. We pay our respects to traditional custodians of country and elders past, present and emerging. Investors and businesses have a responsibility to protect and respect First Nations cultural heritage and can face serious consequences if they fail. Today, we welcome to the show two guests, Rachel Perkins and Nagar. Rachel is an Indigenous woman of the Arrernte and Kalkadoon Nation. She is a widely celebrated filmmaker, founder of Blackfella Films, and Executive Director of Cultural Heritage for the National Native Title Council and First Nations Heritage Protection Alliance. Anu is also at the National Native Title Council. He is Director of Clean Energy and Investment. The First Nations Heritage Protection Alliance recently launched its Dhawura Ngilan Business and Investor Guides, a First Nations-led project that provides resources to enable investors and businesses to be proactive about best practice in strategy, operations, and business relationships. We're going to dive deeper into that initiative a little bit later on, so stick around. But before we do, let's start off by defining the concept of First Nations cultural heritage.
Yeah, well, look, I think the good news is that businesses are doing much better than ever before in dealing with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural heritage. You know, many of the big companies have had RAP plans for many years and have really transformed the partnerships with Indigenous people and communities. And certainly after Juukan Gorge, we've seen businesses do a real turnaround in the way they're improving business and their agreements that they make with communities.
Mm-hmm.
But Dhawura Ngilan, which means remembering country, provides principles and a guide for businesses to really be led by Indigenous people in terms of protecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander heritage. Because this heritage makes us unique in the world, and it's something we all share as Australians. So together, when we partner and when we understand each other better, we can work more effectively to protect this unique and rich 65,000 years or more Indigenous culture and heritage.
And Rachel, what are the key legislations that companies need to be aware of?
Well, because we're a federated country, of course, all the states and territories have their own heritage legislations. So the main one at the federal level is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act, called ATSIPA. And that's been in place since 1984 and is currently being reviewed, because actually what we've found is not only at the federal level but at all of the states and territories that the legislation isn't fit for purpose. It's actually not protecting Indigenous heritage to the standards that we expect.
Right.
But it's not just laws, it's in the practices that we do better.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why Dhawura Ngilan is so important, because it's not necessarily about laws, it's about what you do in everyday business that can make a difference.
Now, Anu, what kind of risks do missteps in cultural heritage pose to investors?
Well, there's significant risks that businesses and investors face. Financial, legal, reputational damage, if they fail to adequately address cultural heritage risks.
Mm-hmm.
But as Rachel described, there's also, some really deep and often irreversible impacts on traditional owners from these activities.
Mm-hmm.
They have a cultural obligation to protect country, and so it's a loss both to Australia and the world's heritage. For businesses and investors, there's significant financial costs that can stem from project cancellations, delays, legal fees, reputational damage.
Mm-hmm.
And that can really impact a business's ability to raise capital and at reasonable cost, because investors want assurance that the companies in which they invest are mitigating this risk by respecting First Nations heritage. And businesses generally are now, I think, focusing more and more on strong ESG performance which is becoming really crucial to receiving loans and other finance.
Let's talk about how to go beyond laws and into best practice. Anu, can you tell us about the Dhawura Ngilan Business and Investor Initiative? What has been achieved so far and what is planned moving forward?
So what's been achieved is that there's now a new best practice standard for protecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural heritage. The Business and Investor Initiative has put together a set of guides. They were drafted by Terry Jenke and Company, a 100% Indigenous owned and run law firm that consulted with First Nations, business, and investment groups. There are two guides. There's a set of principles and a business and investor implementation guide. And these offer practical steps for the private sector to reach beyond legislative standards and to implement leading practice for cultural heritage as defined by First Nations peoples. So if you look at the business and investor guide, it sort of steps out the steps that businesses should take to uphold the right to free, prior, and informed consent. That's a specific right for Indigenous peoples enshrined under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to give or withhold consent to a project that may affect them. And so FPIC enables Indigenous peoples to negotiate the conditions under which a project is to be designed, implemented, how it should be monitored. And as I say, it gives the right to provide or withhold consent as well. The guide also addresses the due diligence that investors should undertake to manage those legal, financial, and reputational risks associated with First Nations cultural heritage destruction. These two guides were launched in Canberra in March by the First Nations Heritage Protection Alliance. And so moving forward, the initiative is working with key businesses and investors to implement these guides within their operations. So over the next 12 to 18 months, we're working with some key businesses and some key investors to implement the guides and to put this First Nations-led advice into action. And I should say that we can't do this work without the important support of our sponsors, which principally is BHP. We also have financial support for the initiative from Lend-Lease, HESTA, KPMG, and Perpetual. And I think more than anything, the initiative underscores the importance of collaboration between industry and traditional owners in protecting cultural heritage.
Now, Rachel, you are a really prolific filmmaker that has helped significantly shape the Australian industry. I want to ask you about storytelling as a tool for social change and how you apply these skills to your work communicating to the corporate world.
Well, I think there's a moment we're in where business is much more aware of its social responsibility and the impact it can have. And shareholders have become, much more active. And so people are looking for ways to connect. They're looking for ways to understand. They're looking for ways to, have a better impact on the world. And so, as a filmmaker, I think the great story is of our country is the deep time connection that we all share to this land, and that flows through First Nations people and can be shared with broader Australians. And I see that a lot in the business sector, during Reconciliation Week, during NAIDOC Week, in the way that people have employment targets and all sorts of initiatives within their business, recognition of traditional owners whose country they operate on. We're seeing it every day. And for me, I'm 54 now. When I was a young girl, there was nothing like this, So we're seeing real improvements, and it's about sharing the Australian story, who we are as Australians, but it's also ensuring that First Nations people's rights as First Nations are respected and embraced, and that First Nations people, we're aspiring to have an equitable position in this country. So the corporate world just has such a big role in all of those ambitions. It's just wonderful seeing that, people, really embracing that at the most senior levels of industry in this country. So it's a very positive outlook.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. Where can people find out more about the Dhawura Ngilan Business and Investor Initiative?
Well, all the principles and guides are online. It's a bit of a mouthful, so because it's in Ngunnawal language, but it's DHAWURA. Ngilan is spelled NGILAN. So Dhawura Ngilan Business and Investor Guide. So yeah, everything's downloadable and online.
Thank you so much. I'm Rosemary Petrass, and that is a wrap for today. Tune in next week to hear retirement heavyweight Jeremy Cooper's plan to reform the superannuation system for climate action.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability, a show about people, the planet, and investing in our collective future. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. The Greener Way podcast gives listeners access to information and educational content provided by discussing numerous financial sustainable options and our featured guests. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. The hosts of The Greener Way are not financial professionals and are not aware of your personal financial circumstances. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement and, if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.